Welcome to Episode 4 of IMPACT Medicom's podcast series on precision medicine and oncology. In this episode, hosted by IMPACT Medicom's Sarah Doucette, we welcome Barry Stein, President and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Canada. Barry is an established lawyer in the fields of commercial and corporate law with the law firm of GWBR LLP in Montreal. He dedicates a significant portion of his practice to labor law as well as litigation in health and administrative law. In addition to being president of Colorectal Cancer Canada, Barry is the past president of the Coalition Priorité Cancer au Québec. He is also past chair of the IQVIA Advisory Council for the Advancement of Health in Quebec and a member of the board of directors of the Canadian Personalized Healthcare Innovation Network, EXACTIS Innovation, and the Quebec Clinical Research Organization in Cancer, Q-CROC. As a survivor of metastatic colorectal cancer with an impressive knowledge of healthcare systems, Barry discusses the current state of access to genomic profiling for cancer patients in Quebec and provides a patient's perspective on the value of precision medicine. Hope you enjoy it.
Hello, listeners. To continue our discussion from past episodes where we looked at access to genomic profiling for cancer patients in BC and Ontario, this episode will touch on the issues of access to genomic profiling in Quebec. So I'm excited to introduce Barry Stein, President and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Canada, who will be sharing his insights and expertise. So welcome, Barry.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
So to start us off, Barry, could you tell us a bit about how Colorectal Cancer Canada was formed and what the goals of this organization are?
Sure. So actually, it's a patient-led organization, first and foremost. I myself was a patient with metastatic colorectal cancer, having been diagnosed in 1995. And unfortunately, due to the inability to receive care in Canada, I was obliged to leave the country for care, not only because the treatments that I required weren't available here, but it couldn't happen in a more timely manner, or in the timely manner that I needed. I ended up going to the United States for treatment and suing the Quebec government for reimbursement at the time. So not a lot of options in 1995 for metastatic colorectal cancer patients. There was one drug, a chemotherapy that was available and used for 40 years. And there really wasn't, this is prior to the targeted therapies and certainly no precision medicines at that time. So what happened in about 1998, having gone through multiple surgeries, both in the US and here, I found myself in a situation where I had no evidence of disease, but still undergoing treatment, adjuvant treatment, and there were no resources for patients around. So together with a board, which included Dr. Tony Fields and Dr. John Maroon, who are now all retired, we started the Colorectal Cancer Association of Canada at that time in order to provide better resources for patients. And ultimately, again, a lot of notoriety, if you will, because I won my judgment against the Quebec government and became a landmark decision for out-of-country healthcare. But at the same time, it also helped us to gain recognition as a patient organization in areas of awareness of the disease, which really no one was talking about colorectal cancer at that time, that's for sure, in terms of education for patients and creating consensus statements among healthcare professionals, providing support for patients in all sorts of new ways, and ultimately in advocacy for important areas that brought about population-based screening for colorectal cancer in Canada, as well as areas in primary prevention, and maybe most importantly, in equal and timely access for effective treatments to improve patient outcomes. And that really is at the heart of matters that we're probably going to discuss today, because that's where precision medicine comes in today as really being, a point of reference for all future treatments, not just for colon cancer or colorectal cancer, but for all cancers.
Yeah, and that's a great lead into my next question, since the topic of the podcast today is going to be precision medicine and genomic profiling. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the kind of initiatives that Colorectal Cancer Canada has developed that focus on these areas.
So really, a lot of our work is pan-cancer, not just in colon cancer. And it's really at the heart of where treatment is going, and that's in terms of precision medicines. One of the problems about precision medicine is that the better that the researchers get in identifying these different molecular profiles or mutations, the harder it is to get them approved, because you'll never have a phase 3 trial because the group of patients is very small. And that really poses a problem both at the regulatory stage and the health technology assessment stage. So we believe that because, the way this seems to be going, that probably we won't be treating so much by disease site in the future, but really by molecular profile. And we see that beginnings of that right now, for example, in the CAPTURE trial that's ongoing, where we're giving, for example, breast cancer drugs to colon cancer patients who have the breast cancer mutations. So this is really, a fundamental shift in the way we're treating cancer and the way we're going to treat cancer. In that line of work, I became engaged with the Canadian Personalized Healthcare Innovation Network in discussions also with Health Canada and CADA and INES in Quebec on access to these precision medicines and how patients could get access to these types of therapies quickly, and what it would take in terms of system change to do that, to grant, in other words, conditional approvals subject to the collection of real-world evidence. And this is the story really of precision medicine. But as we talk about precision medicines, we won't get anywhere unless we can identify the appropriate patients who could benefit from this. And this means that we need some foundational work in Canada to create that infrastructure, an equal and equitable infrastructure across the country so that all patients can gain access to these new precision medicines.
Mm-hmm. And so I know I recently watched a presentation by one of your program managers at the Global Colorectal Cancer Congress talking about the Get Personal campaign and a survey you did with clinicians to kind of understand the variability in access to genomic profiling across the provinces. Can you tell us a little bit about what came out of that survey?
Sure, but perhaps maybe first I'll tell you a little bit about what we call our Get Personal program at Colorectal Cancer Canada. So the objectives of this program, Get Personal, in terms of molecular profiling, is to raise awareness among patients, clinicians, and policymakers on the full range of biomarker tests and cancer treatments to be made available for patients, to identify the variations that we've seen, and I'll tell you a little bit more about, in access to testing and personalized treatments across the country, to address the needs and gaps in Canadian personalized medicine by gathering patients' experiences and information, and finally to put molecular profiling and personalized medicine on the agenda of government, healthcare providers, and key decision makers. Notwithstanding COVID, this is certainly extremely important. And as you know, more people are dying from cancer in Canada than they are from COVID at this point. So we really need to advocate for equitable access across the country. So maybe now I could tell you a little bit about our survey, and then I'll tell you, a little bit about the Quebec experience as well. So first, we did a general survey in about 42 institutions across the country. So not all the institutions. We sent it out to about 150 different practitioners in all sorts of fields in oncology, and we got 42 really thorough responses, and who all have actually agreed to be on an advisory committee for publication ultimately and for providing insights to patients as this program moves forward with precision medicine. What we found was that there's generally no national guideline or coordination between centers, all of which is impacting access to precision medicine. And that's not only between provinces, but within provinces, and sometimes within the same institution. People are doing things differently. And our overall conclusions and findings are circulated around three topic areas. One was the type of the test that's used and the turnaround time. And we found that the type of molecular testing that's done varied greatly, that the turnaround time really was unpredictable in most cases for different biomarkers. And as I said, varied between provinces and within provinces. And turnaround time is extremely important when you're talking about clinical practice, because when you have patients, for example, that are brought into emergency with advanced disease, physicians want to start treatment right away. So if it's a first-line treatment, for example, some of the new immunotherapies coming down the pipeline, or if you have a left-sided tumor, for example, in colon cancer, and you want to have first-line anti-EGFR, which is not necessarily the rule in terms of standard care, you want to have this information at your fingertips, and you need it fast. And very often, they cannot do this fast enough to change what would normally be standard practice to what is very personalized for that patient. So turnaround time is exceedingly important. The other thing we found was who orders the test varied greatly. And often we see it's the medical oncologists that are doing it. But for us, that's too late. So we want to see patients evaluated or profiled on diagnosis. And that way we can see better planning for patient care. And we can also plan for clinical trials early on and really have a better understanding. But more than that, we think it would be economically beneficial, because you would have one test done up front. You wouldn't have to worry about who's going to order it and when they're going to order it. And we would have that information in a very timely manner. The next thing that we saw was that when the test was ordered, as I said, we want to see it up front, but it's done at various different points in the patient care, actually. And most often we see it done, when patients go to see their oncologists, sometimes before, if they're lucky enough, but usually after they have their first visit, and treatments are already planned. So this is really, a paramount importance that it's done early on. And then the last one is around funding. And obviously, this is where we really have a big divergence across the country, and something that, it really poses a problem. So if we wanted to have, full molecular profiling of a patient done, very often the patient, if they can afford it, will have to, do testing out of country at great cost, or settle for something like a, single gene or single type of test done for a particular drug. And it's just not efficient, and it really does not make for the best planning to improve patient outcomes. And after all, what is this all about, right? It's about improving patient outcomes in the end. And when we're talking about cancer, this is fundamental to increasing overall survival, but at least improving their quality of life. When we looked at Quebec, it wasn't so dissimilar from the rest of the country, although there are fundamental problems, in how it's administered with a central laboratory system. And now we see a regrouping in terms of molecular profiling and a network in Quebec growing, and that's really exciting and nice to see. But out of our 42 responders, 9 of them came from Quebec, from 7 different institutions. In other words, some institutions, more than one person responded. Actually, 6 of these 9 responses were in colorectal cancer. So it's not just in colorectal cancer. And what we found was that 4 of the 7 institutions that reported were actually using next generation sequencing. And their average turnaround was certainly not 4 days, but 3.2 weeks. So you see this great variation. We heard in a previous podcast that it can be done in 4 days. So we know it's possible, but generally speaking, that's far from where it's at in the country. So if it's a first line treatment, waiting over 3 weeks, it's not optimal, that's for sure. We want to see that done faster. And in Quebec, we've seen that there's both in-house and off-site profiling being done. For most of the general ones that you would think, BRCA1, 2, KRAS, ROS, NTRK, ALK, PD-L1, HER2, EGFR, KIT, BRAF, and so forth. But there were a few missing. I mean, we're not having tumor mutational burden and so forth. There's a ways to go to get the full profiling. But generally speaking, it can be done. It's just a question of timing. And one of the interesting things is there are a few centers, particularly in Montreal, where patients are being either profiled on diagnosis, or in other cases, it's only when the person has shown to have metastatic disease, and only in certain disease sites, as mentioned in the report. The more popular one ones, lung and colorectal. And what we like about lung cancer is we see that's happening more reflex. It's being done right away for lung cancer patients. And we think that that's the optimal way to go as well for colorectal cancer patients. So that's a little bit of an amplification of what's in the IMPACT report, but it's also, gives you a sense of what patients are looking for in terms of reflex testing. And of course, there are barriers to that. There's the cost barrier, needless to say. But I think it's going to be much more efficient in the long run to do that as the cost of profiling comes down. And we see that dropping rather fast. In fact, everything, it seems, is happening now. In the last year, I've never seen so much action in this area than I have since 1998, that's for sure. But there are other real barriers, for example, a lack of pathologists, a lack of equipment, and maybe more importantly, the lack of coordination between the various disciplines. We did also take a look at a few different questions which I can highlight today, which correspond with what's in the report. Participants were questioned, and these are the professionals at this point, who were questioned in what settings molecular profiling is used to make patient care decisions at their institutions. And the results showed that more than half of them, 56% in fact, of the Quebec participants make patient care decisions for patients with metastatic disease or advanced refractory disease, or if there is a Health Canada approved therapy for that biomarker. And 89% of the respondents said that they were doing it for patients with metastatic disease rather than just being right done at diagnosis. So we see that this is sort of corresponding with doing the profiling when a drug exists or something exists which can be utilized right away. So not just for the purposes of profiling, but if you're going to access clinical trials at a later date, if you're going to do fundamental research in Canada, this is a fantastic opportunity to do it upfront, reflex for all patients, garner that information for research purposes in the aggregate and share that data for research, provide patients with the opportunity downstream for clinical trials. Knowing what's coming, down the road for patients helps to reduce a lot of stress and really help to make clinical decisions earlier than they are right now.
That's a good point. As we had been discussing earlier, things are moving so quickly that it's better to do it up front, because in a month or 2 or 3, who knows what's going to be available for those patients.
Absolutely. And patients have to also, physicians want that information as early as possible in order to make, their treatment decisions. And what we found was, that only a small number, like 22% of our respondents, were able to report that they had that information early enough so that at least between 50 and 75% of their patients would have that information before deciding on their first-line therapy.
Yeah, so you want that information upfront so you can pick the right treatment at the right time, right? Opposed to picking the wrong one first, potentially.
Right. I mean, we always like to say we want the right patient to get the right treatment at the right time. And we really mean that. The more that we see access to precision medicines growing, or as we see more clinical trials being accessed for the purposes, of those patients with advanced disease, generally speaking. But knowing that up front makes a huge difference to a patient, knowing what options are in front of you, what your treatment lineup will be, and providing hope to patients through clinical trials and accessing these new treatments. If you know that up front, that goes a long way to help reducing the stress, from patients. And we know because we just did a patient survey as well, and we've just been putting that together. And we have some preliminary results that I could share from that as well.
Yeah, that actually was going to just go into my next question, which was how do patients view the level of access to and the value of genomic profiling?
Sure. So in the survey, we really wanted to assess the needs and the gaps in personalized healthcare and medicine by understanding the patient experience with biomarker testing in cancer treatments across the country. Our insights are in a couple of interesting areas. First, I would say from an educational or knowledge point of view, we want to know what patients actually knew about molecular profiling, if anything at all. I think we had about 150 responders, and only about 14% of them learned about biomarkers from their cancer team at diagnosis, and about 70% at treatment selection time. So, quite low numbers, not very well informed. And we're not sure, we can't point blame to anybody, but certainly oncologists and physicians in general, are very busy, and it's hard to take that time that extra time to explain about it. And that's one of the reasons why we feel it should be done early on. And 50% didn't discuss biomarkers with their cancer team. 73% said that the oncologist did not explain biomarker testing before the treatment started. And only about 26% of the respondents got their actual biomarkers done and did their profiling. So not everybody is getting profiled for sure. And about 64% said their oncologist didn't even offer the biomarker testing prior to discussions about their treatment plans. So they were going in a bit blind and being offered the standard reimbursed treatments without being asked whether there was anything specific to it, which is perfectly understandable for the most part as the system stands today. But that's what we want to change. These are the opportunities that precision medicine provides today and will increasingly do so. So this is a very important time to start making those foundational changes so that we can actually give these patients options and treatment choices and opportunities that didn't exist before. They were also asked if they value biomarker testing. Did they think it was, of any value to them? 69% of the patients felt that the testing would help them find the right personalized treatment. And, one of the things we often hear from physicians who say, if you're going to do all this profiling, it's not really going to help you very much because we don't have access to these medicines. Well, to me, I know that patients are very resourceful, and I've seen this, over many, many years. And if we can identify a treatment, whether or not it's reimbursed, the ingenuity of the patient, and sometimes with the help of the physician, helps them to provide access to those precision medicines. And we've seen this, going back, to the early adoption of the targeted therapies in Canada. When some physicians thought the patients, why bother telling them about it because they'll never get access to it. And actually, as soon as they found out about it, they did get access to it, either by fundraising, by accessing it elsewhere, or on clinical trials, of course, extremely important. And when asked what they would change about their experience with biomarker testing, the majority said that they wished they were more available and easier to access, that they wanted to be more aware of it upon their diagnosis about molecular profiling. They wanted it to be offered to them early on rather than discovering it after treatment decisions were made, and that they would get these results back faster so that they could access either the treatments or the trial. And of course, knowing about some of the other country costs, they wanted to see those costs drop and be offered within the Canadian system rather than having to, at great cost, send it out of country, which obviously not everybody was able to do.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that becomes an issue of now it not being equitable. Not everyone can do that. So I know you mentioned the report a little bit earlier, and we've talked about the report in every previous episode of the podcast, but just to give another recap. So we have a report we shared with you that was recently published by IMPACT Medicom, and it highlights the need for comprehensive genomic profiling for patients with advanced and metastatic cancers. So this report was developed in collaboration with expert oncologists, pathologists, and reimbursement specialists in Canada. And in the report, we offer a list of recommendations on how funding for this type of genomic testing can be prioritized. So what are your thoughts on the value of comprehensive genomic profiling for cancer patients in general and colorectal cancer specifically? So like looking at specifically a type of genomic profiling that uses NGS, it simultaneously examines the 4 major classes of genomic alterations and includes at minimum all the clinically relevant genomic biomarkers.
So I guess you wouldn't be surprised if I said that it's foundational and central to personalized treatments in Canada to the benefit of all patients. this is the way the science is going. This is what we see, being submitted for approval to Health Canada at the regulatory level. This is where we see the clinical trials going in terms of precision medicines. So it's fundamental that we do get this broad-based genomic profiling, readily and equally or equitably available across the country. There is really a paradigm shift in the way cancer patients are beginning now to be treated. And we believe you hardly will see a new chemotherapy being approved. Even targeted therapies are more rare, but we do see the precision medicines and immunotherapies really heating up in the pipeline of the drug companies as well. So if patients are to get access to it, we have to start building a consensus across the country so that there is national guidelines, if you will, for this, so that we can see how funds are utilized to build this infrastructure so that there is access to these drugs. And it goes all the way through the pipeline because this is fundamental for regulatory approval and reimbursement at the health technology assessment level and at the provincial level, all the way through the system. If you can't identify the patients, then how are you going to give them the right drug at the right time? And I think, we're starting to see that. The other day, a decision was finally rendered, favorable recommendation for the reimbursement of a NTRK drug. And this is a drug that applies for a whole basket of different types of cancers, so colon cancer, lung cancer, thyroid, salivary gland, and other cancers. And if you have NTRK fusion, then this drug will work for you. Now, here's the problem. Apart from the cost of the drug, how do we identify the patients that this drug would work for? It is recommended right now for third-line treatment, so there's a bit of time for patients who will have to have had other, basic treatment, standard therapies, if you will, before getting this drug. But it's probably likely in the future that it may even be a first-line treatment. Now, it's only now we're beginning to screen for NTRK fusion. And this is just one marker in colorectal that we're looking for. So we're looking for EGFR, we're looking for BRAF, and there's a new BRAF V600E drug coming down the pipeline that's actually being considered at CADTH and INES right now for reimbursement. There's HER2, which we look for now in colorectal cancer patients. Now NTRK and so forth. And so there's a whole host of things that we're looking for. And doing this individual type of testing just doesn't make sense. So we want to do this comprehensive genomic profiling of patients for clinical treatment, for accessing clinical trials, and ultimately for basic research over time and gathering that aggregate data that can be used to better understand and attack cancer.
Mm-hmm. So what value do you think this report might provide to decision makers, specifically in Quebec? Like, what is the process there of gaining funding or reimbursement for the testing?
I mean, the difference in Quebec may be as different from some of the other provinces that they have this centralized OptiLab system. And this actually can cause a problem as well because it slows things down. We like to see, centers of excellence where the healthcare professionals work together as a team and quickly. In other words, if you have, we'll use the example of a lung cancer patient in Quebec City, there's opportunity for the pathologist, the surgeon, and the oncologist to work together and to work quickly as a team and have that on-site NGS sequencing done and turn around very, very quickly in delays, was mentioned before, 4 days, maybe even less. So that is kind of like the optimal type of thing that we would like to see, for patients in general. But if we have to look at the provincial, sort of guidelines and start looking at centralizing these types of systems, these type of recommendations are extremely important, and I think will help to guide some of the discussion. The Quebec government likes to do things themselves, and even if it means redoing it. So I think it would do well, though, to form the basic work in Quebec and start creating these guidelines. The good news is that there is a network in molecular profiling that's been established, Quebec Molecular Diagnostic Network, and there is cooperation between about 5 or 6 different centers, which includes McGill, the Jewish, the CHUM, Saint Justin, the CHOC in Quebec City, and so forth. And I think they're starting to collaborate more greatly and come out, ultimately they'll come out with a consensus. But as I said, I think it's important to have a national, meaning Canadian consensus, not just provincial consensuses, so that there may even be opportunities to get some foundational funding from the federal government as we look to bring in precision medicines in this country and create equitable access across the country. So we know that there's variances between the provinces in terms of access. And this is sort of the one thing that really bothers cancer patients.
Okay, so I have one last question, and I think it's basically impossible to have a discussion around healthcare right now without touching on the impact of COVID-19. So I wanted to ask, how might the COVID-19 pandemic impact the need for and access to genomic testing and precision medicines for cancer patients in the coming years?
So this is actually another area of work that we're doing, and we call this Ready for the Next Round. And the idea is that we know from research that's ongoing and published articles in British Medical Journal by Canadian and UK researchers that for every month delay in cancer treatment, the mortality will increase by about 10%. And what does that mean? Well, let me actually say one other thing. When we talk about our screening programs, our colorectal cancer screening programs, by way of example, which were periodically suspended and during COVID and creating increased delays for colonoscopy, huge delays for colonoscopy and for surgery, that we know that there's going to be a mother lode, if you will, of advanced cancer patients coming down the pipeline. We start to see small examples of that on a daily basis, but ultimately there are huge numbers of people who have either not been identified as cancer patients, they haven't been discovered as yet, and consequently, when they are discovered, they're going to be in a more advanced stage. And what that means is that they will need more expensive treatments, which include the precision medicines at great cost. So there's a whole bunch of downstream costs that are coming when patients are going to need to access these precision medicines. So it's important that we get this foundation in order, that we have this profiling, comprehensive genomic profiling ultimately available, and we don't have to sort of build it as we fly the plane. We want to have that foundational work done. We want to have that testing there, and then that will ease the way for patient access to these precision medicines.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Barry, for this great discussion. It was really great to get kind of the patient perspective, which we haven't seen yet in the past podcast episodes. Thank you for joining us, and I really look forward to seeing kind of the results of your surveys coming out in the Get Personal campaign. So thanks
so much.
Take care.